Hello, everyone. Welcome to the eighth episode of the TCLF One-on-One series. Through the One-on-One series, we aim to interact with the best legal professionals in India and abroad. And we're thrilled to have Mr. Abhiroop Dasgupta as our guest for the eighth episode. Mr. Abhiroop Dasgupta is a partner in the dispute resolution and insolvency and restructuring practices at HSA Advocates. He is a law graduate from University School of Law and Legal Studies, Delhi, and has over 10 years of experience in dispute resolution. He specializes in insolvency and bankruptcy laws, securitization laws, and corporate and banking litigation. In fact, he's one of the earliest practitioners of the insolvency law in India since the enactment of the IBC in 2016, and has argued and appeared for the first ever resolution plan approved in India. He regularly advises all stakeholders involved in insolvency processes at the NCLT, NCLAT, High Courts, and Supreme Court. It's an honor to have you here today, sir.
Thank you so much, Tansi, for inviting me. And thanks a lot to the Contemporary Law Forum. It's quite an honor to be part of this. So thanks once again.
Yes, thank you so much for taking out the time to talk to us today. And now to start with, could you, your practice covers dispute resolution in various aspects of this. So could you give us a brief overview of what this entails and how your dispute practice is in a firm setup as opposed to a chamber or a private or an independent practice?
So I'll just travel back in time. I was pretty lost as a law student. Both my parents were school teachers. My mom was teaching maths and my dad was teaching chemistry. So you can imagine how far removed my family was from this profession. I was lucky enough to start my career at Dheer & Dheer Associates. To tell you very honestly, when I started off, I didn't even know if I wanted to do litigation. I was completely at sea. But luckily for me, I took a liking to litigation from the very beginning. And with each passing day, I have loved litigation more and more. Back then, there was no IBC. I mostly used to practice in the DRT under the Securitization Act and under the RDDB and FI Act. While I was in Dheer & Dheer, I was plain lucky to have like great mentors. And I can proudly say that all my mentors back there are all pioneers in this field today. So when IBC was introduced in December 2016, to be honest, the future was quite uncertain. We didn't know for sure how our core practice before the DRTs will pan out. But I was lucky to be part of the first insolvency petition filed in India under Section 10 of the IBC. This was before the NCLT Hyderabad, a case named Synergies Dure. As you said while introducing me, it also happened to be the first case in India where a resolution plan was sanctioned. More importantly, in fact, most importantly, this was the case which led to the introduction of Section 29A to the IBC, which prevents disqualified promoters for bidding for their own companies which are undergoing insolvency. After that, I also represented the financial creditor in the first resolution plan, which was sanctioned by the principal bench here in Delhi. It was this corporate debtor named Hotel Godawan Private Limited. It was a heavily contested matter. And pertaining to this Hotel Godawan, you will find several reported judgments of the NCLT, NCLAT, the High Courts, and even the Supreme Court. All these cases really set the ball rolling and settled a lot of initial uncertainties in the IBC. So since I happened to be part of all these cases, it really taught me a lot in this field. All this exposure under the IBC, it helped me make a move to HSA, where I am today. So I would consider myself twice lucky, as HSA turned out to be a very, very dynamic place to work with not only lots of exposure, but also a lot of freedom in many ways. So I have been looking after the disputes and litigation side of insolvency, banking, finance, restructuring, and all their commercial litigation basically. As far as the nature of work of a disputes practitioner in a firm is concerned, I believe that it is much wider than the work performed by a contemporary hardcore litigator. So while we are doing everything that a pure litigator does, being part of a firm, like a proper top tier firm, we also end up doing a lot of advisory work. This involves a lot of legal opinions on complex issues where huge companies and conglomerates They are ready to act on deals worth millions of dollars just on the basis of what comes out of our keyboard. So having said that, one of the most important aspects of being part of a firm is your relation with your team. I mean, as the cliche goes, you're only as good as your team is. So having a solid team is a condition precedent for a successful firm practice. I feel it's quite difficult to survive in a firm without having each other's backs. Another big difference of being a litigator in a firm setup is cross-selling and cross-references. So our firm has about 34 partners. Apart from the work that we generate ourselves, a huge chunk of work comes through cross-selling from other partners. Of course, you have to be trustworthy enough to make a partner send his own client to you. And lastly, being part of a firm, I feel specialization is quite important, because of late, personally, I'm observing this tendency that clients have become quite aware and proactive, and they will only look out for specialists for specific solutions. So this has been a paradigm shift in the last decade, I feel, and people who want to be a part of any firm must be conscious of this fact. Over to you, Tansi.
Yeah, so that's quite true. And in fact, you specialize in the IBC, as you said, it might have been luck, or it might have been just your exposure in the field. But the IBC has been lauded as the most successful resolution and recovery process. So could you tell us about the IBC and how it's different from its preceding acts? Because the Sarfasi Act, for example, was not as successful as the IBC has been appreciated to be.
So, the IBC and its rules and regulations, they govern the provisions pertaining to the reorganization and insolvency resolution of corporate persons and individuals in a time-bound manner. That is what the object and purpose and the statement of objects basically says. As per the provisions of the IBC, if a company commits a default of a minimum value of 1 crore now, then its financial creditor, operational creditor, or such company itself may initiate the insolvency resolution process. For beginners, a financial creditor is someone who has lent money to the corporate debtor, while an operational creditor is someone who has provided goods or services to that company. So once an insolvency petition is admitted, the powers of the directors are suspended and a neutral insolvency professional is appointed. Simultaneously, claims are invited from all classes of creditors, and a committee of creditors is formed comprising only of the financial creditors who have a pro rata vote on the basis of their outstanding debt. Now, the insolvency professional, the IRP or the RP as the case may be, he runs the corporate debtor as a going concern along with the committee of creditors for a period of 180 days. This can be extended to 330 days and in some exceptional circumstances to even beyond that period. So during this period, the RP and the committee of creditors, they make an attempt to resolve the insolvency of the corporate debtor by calling for resolution plans from eligible resolution applicants. The resolution plan has to provide for dues to each class of creditors. And subject to fulfilling all these legal requirements, the committee of creditors, they vote on the resolution plan. If the resolution plan is approved by 66%, it has to be sent to the NCLT for their approval. And if and when it is approved by the NCLT, it becomes binding on each and every stakeholder. But if there is no resolution plan, or if the resolution plans which have come in, they're not acceptable to the committee of creditors in majority, 66% that is, the corporate debtor will mandatorily be sent for liquidation. So this law is a paradigm shift from the existing laws regarding insolvency and also the laws pertaining to recovery of dues by various stakeholders. This is, if I can say, this is like a one-stop shop where every stakeholder of an insolvent party, you can imagine, they are all taken care of. Most importantly, the erstwhile regime of debtor in possession has now been replaced by the creditor in possession regime. So I have said this before also that in the prior to the 90s, all courts you can imagine, starting from the lowest district courts up to the Supreme Court, including all high courts, they were clogged with cases filed by banks and financial institutions for recovery of debts. In 93, they realized, they thought enough is enough. We need a specialized tribunals. because they are taking up all the time of the courts. These specialized tribunals were set up, which were called the DRT in 1993, where there was a quick mechanism for adjudication of the debt. After about 10 years, in 2002, the government realized that even the DRT, the RDDB and FI Act, which was enacted in 1993, was not serving its real purpose. So they came out with the Securitization Act, the SARFAESI Act in short. But now this IBC will be a complete game changer. As I have said that the debtor in possession regime has now been replaced by the creditor in possession regime. So under all previous regimes, all previous acts, it was always the debtor, the defaulter who continued to remain in possession while the adjudication continued. So having said that, you have asked regarding what has really changed. I would also like to bring about or bring forward another hypercritical, if you may say, way of looking at this. Hypothetically, if there is a company X and that hypothetical company X has three creditors, A, B, and C. Forget the IBC for a moment. Under any law, if X becomes insolvent or unable to pay its debts, then A, B, and C, they would get whatever value X is worth in respect to their pro rata share and in respect of the priorities of their debt, basically. Incidentally, even after the introduction of the IBC, these three creditors, that is A, B, and C, will get exactly what X is worth. So for nothing has really changed as far as the valuation of the company is concerned, and as far as how much each stakeholder will get. So for really changing the economy or for really improving the current financial state of affairs, what is most important is to ensure how to improve the value of X. The value of X could be dependent on various factors, such as the value of the underlying land, the real estate, the licenses and permits it has, the contracts it has entered into, entrepreneurship in that company, the taxation regime, and a host of other things. So this hypothetical example is certainly hypercritical, but the IBC does try and fix some of these parameters which I have just said. And most importantly, the underlying objective of the IBC is to ensure that any insolvent company must continue as a going concern. So that is the basic difference that IBC has brought about from the previous legislation. Over to you, Tansi.
Yes, that was actually a very helpful comparison with how the IBC, it might not have made major changes, but I think the change in perspective and having a time-bound resolution process has impacted the entire process very, very well. And despite that, the IBC continues to be a growing area of law, and there have been several changes to the Act. And in fact, before June 2020, it had been amended 4 times. And there were several cases also changing the scope of the IBC. So could you give us a brief explanation of what the major changes in the insolvency law have been since it was enacted?
Firstly, you'll have to understand that the IBC was an experiment to bring about a comprehensive legislation, as I said, which would which would effectively deal with all aspects of insolvency and liquidation process of companies, not only companies, but individuals and partnership firms also. So being a completely new legislation and considering the value of stakes involved, it wasn't really unforeseen that there would be numerous occasions of judicial intervention and legislative amendments in the IBC regime, to tweak it and to fill the gaps wherever required. Amazingly, the judiciary and the legislature both have been up to task and up to the game. And let me tell you, no stone has been unturned in this endeavor to being up to speed with the times. Now I'll turn to some of the major amendments. Of course, for all the amendments, we'll possibly require another session, and I have seen books running into thousands of pages which are being written only on the amendments. So in my opinion, the most significant amendment was the introduction of Section 29A. This was in November 2017. Section 29A basically prevents disqualified promoters from bidding for their own companies which are undergoing insolvency. Earlier, a resolution applicant could be any person who submits a resolution plan to the resolution professional, and a resolution plan could be a plan proposed by any person for insolvency resolution of the corporate debtor. There was no specific criteria or qualification or even disqualification for that matter. So persons who by their own misconduct or fraudulent motives or even bad business decisions have contributed to the default of the corporate debtor, they could have regained the control of their company again by bidding with heavy discounts, while banks and other financial institutions would have had to take huge haircuts, which is public money at the end of the day. It's taxpayers' money like you and me. This was highly criticized, and this was the basic rationale for the introduction of Section 29A. So as you must be aware, Section 29A and a host of other provisions were tested on their constitutional validity by the Supreme Court in the famous Swiss Ribbons case. I happen to represent one of the petitioners there as well. Another important change was the Supreme Court judgment of Innoventive versus ICICI. So Section 7 of the IBC pertaining to triggering insolvency proceedings by financial creditors, it didn't exactly provide any mechanism for issuing notice or permitting the corporate debtor to be heard. Because the only threshold which was required was that there should be a default above rupees 1 lakh. And notwithstanding any dispute which exists between the parties, a Section 7 was mandatorily required to be admitted. But the Supreme Court stepped in, and by this judgment, it held that keeping in mind the principles of natural justice, it was incumbent or mandatory on the NCLT to first issue notice and to first hear the corporate debtor before passing any order. Another important amendment that I can think of, the first amendment of 2020, which was passed in March. Amongst other things, the threshold for initiating insolvency was increased from 1 lakh to 1 crore. Also, for real estate companies to initiate insolvency on behalf of home buyers, you have to now file on behalf of either 100 allottees in number, or the petition has to be represented at least by 10% of the allottees. Of course, there was an ordinance on similar lines, which is subject matter of challenge before the Supreme Court, that is still pending as on date. Additionally, companies which are undergoing insolvency can now file for insolvency of other companies as well, which was not permitted earlier due to certain technicality. Another important amendment was the insertion of the explanation basically to Section 14 of the IBC, which basically says that any license, permit, or registration or clearance or any similar grant which is given by the central government, state government, local authority, or any sectoral regulator or any other authority whatsoever, it shall not be suspended or terminated on the grounds of insolvency, subject to there being no default in payment of the current dues, which basically arise for or during the use or continuation during the moratorium period. So this is very, very important for a successful resolution of the company. The rationale behind this is what was happening is that as soon as a company goes into insolvency, all the contracts that it had, all the licenses that it had, all the permits that it had were being arbitrarily cancelled by the government or other regulators. So this is really very helpful for successful resolution of the company. Another very important aspect was the insertion in an introduction of Section 32A, which provides that the corporate debtor shall not be liable for an offence which is committed prior to the commencement of CIRP from the date that the resolution plan is approved by the NCLT. So basically, this means that the previous management, if they had been liable or if they had been responsible for any offences, the new management will not be responsible for those offences and they cannot be tried for those offences. Of course, this is only applicable where there's a change of management by way of a resolution plan. So this section also safeguards the property of the corporate debtor from attachment, seizure, or retention or confiscation. So as you may have studied in law school, the law is dynamic in nature and keeps evolving. Let me tell you that's not a cliche, and that's 100% true, as we are seeing with so many changes. And in the times to come, I am very sure and I'm very hopeful that there are going to be more amendments which will keep this new regime completely up to date. And as Bob Dylan had said, times they are changing. Back to you, Tansi.
Yes, so that's quite true. Times truly are changing, especially considering the current circumstances of the pandemic and of the many changes it has brought about and the effects it's had on the law. Insolvency law, in particular, has been changed a lot and has been impacted a lot, which is why the ordinance on June 5th was passed this year. And could you tell us what the key changes through this ordinance were?
So, in May, as part of, as you may have heard and read about it, as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, the finance minister announced the exemption of all COVID-19 related debts from the ambit of default under the IBC and the suspension of initiation of any fresh insolvency proceedings under section 7, 9 or 10 of the IBC for a period of up to 1 year. However, the government did not announce the relevant dates for this initiative back then. So this was followed up by reports that on 3rd June, the Union Cabinet had approved the proposal for suspension of sections 7, 9 and 10 of the IBC for non-performing assets specifically during the COVID-19 period starting from 25th of March. This was the background in which this amendment finally came about. There was a lot of suspense as to what is going to be the fine print actually. Now let's talk about the amendment, which was finally brought about on the 5th of June. The second amendment was introduced, of course, since the parliament was not in session. This was brought about by an ordinance. Why the parliament is not in session is an altogether different topic. Let's not go there for now. So this amendment simply mentions that for any default which occurred after 25th of March for a period of 6 months will be exempted from the rigors of IBC. So as of now, if any default occurs between 25th March and 25th September, no IBC proceeding can ever be filed with respect to that debt. So this period of 6 months is further extendable to up to 1 year. They have further clarified specifically that the ordinance would not apply to any defaults before 25th March. Apart from that, in the IBC, there is a section, a provision, section 66 pertaining to fraudulent transactions. So if the resolution professional finds out that there has been fraudulent trading or wrongful trading before the commencement of the insolvency proceedings or even during these proceedings, the resolution professional is duty bound to file an application before the NCLT for reversal of that transaction. But in this amendment, they have introduced section 66 subsection 3, which basically says that no such application can be filed for reversal of these transactions in respect of defaults which are covered under section 10A. So basically which have occurred after 25th of March. So these are the only changes for now, but considering the state of our economy, Tansi, personally, I feel that many more initiatives will be required from the government to bring things back on track. Otherwise it might be a case of too little, too late. Back to you.
Yes, so in fact, one of the major changes you mentioned was the temporary suspension of section 7, 9, and 10 of the IBC. And while that is an extremely welcome relief for corporate debtors, it will simultaneously burden lenders as well. So what do you think the impact of this suspension will be and the exclusion of COVID-19 related defaults from the definition of default under section 10A? and how it's impact businesses, and how do you think other financial institutions like the RBI and SEBI will have to accommodate these concerns?
So, as you may be aware, RBI had previously issued guidelines on 12th of February 2018, which made it mandatory for lenders with debts above rupees 2,000 crores to explore a resolution, failing which they were mandatorily required to approach the NCLT. These guidelines were challenged before the Supreme Court by various stakeholders uh, in the famous Dharani Sugar judgment, of which also I was lucky to be part of, which ultimately quashed this circular in April 2019 for being ultra vires. So this 12th February 2018 circular was quashed in April 2019. Immediately thereafter, on 7th of June of the same year, 2019, the RBI introduced the Prudential Framework on Resolution of Stressed Assets, which in simple terms provides for a framework for resolution of stressed assets outside the ambit of IBC. So one of the major departures from the previous RBI guidelines was that while the previous RBI guideline made it mandatory for the lender to go to the NCLT, here it is the discretion of that lender. Now, these measures in these guidelines, they provide an alternate to lenders to resolve the debts without approaching the NCLT. So after the outbreak of COVID and after declaration of the lockdown, on 17th of April, the RBI introduced certain instructions relating to extension of resolution timelines under the RBI directions, such as extending the timelines pertaining to the review period or the residual review period during which all the lenders decide what is the way forward. So therefore, the RBI directions could have been the most sought after remedy by lenders in case of suspension of section 7, 9 and 10 as the case is now. But according to me, there is a slight catch to it. In the RBI directions, default has been defined as having the same meaning ascribed to it under the IBC. So all COVID related debts might be exempted from the purview of such directions, because the default under the RBI directions means the default under the IBC. But by introducing section 10A to the IBC, default is not really a default if it has occurred during the lockdown. So we don't know if there is, I feel this is an anomaly of whether the RBI directions will be applicable during the lockdown, and I think it has to be adequately addressed by the RBI. Having said that, lenders will always have the right to take action under the SARFAESI Act and under the Recovery of Debts and Bankruptcy Act, as it is now called. Even in the RBI guidelines pertaining to moratorium of repayment of loans, which has been in news quite a lot recently, because of COVID-19, the discretion of granting or not granting the moratorium is completely with the lenders. They can refuse to grant moratorium during this crisis, and they can even declare the accounts as non-performing assets, and they can proceed to exercise whatever rights are available to them under law. So I feel that apart from the clarification regarding the applicability of the RBI guidelines of 7th of June 2019, I think lenders have adequate safeguards in terms of exercising their rights as are legitimately available to them under law for recovery of their dues. Over to you, Tansi.
Yes, sir, that's quite true. In fact, there are alternate ways to restructure loans apart from the IBC, and there definitely will need to be some changes brought about to the RBI guidelines and how this restructuring can take place, and especially in light of the amendment to Section 10A. One more change you mentioned earlier was the fact that the threshold under the IBC has been increased from 1 lakh rupees to 1 crore rupee. And that has impacted the IBC a lot. In fact, it has impacted MSMEs and other lenders as well. So what is your opinion on this change?
I'll respond to that in short. So this measure has been brought about, the purpose, which is the stated purpose, is to safeguard the already ailing businesses, and this might provide uh, some relief to the debtors in these unprecedented times. So as you're aware, this relief would only be limited to debtors with debts of less than rupees 1 crore. So essentially, it will be applicable to small scale defaulters and possibly MSMEs. But if we examine this minutely, it could be a double-edged sword. I'll tell you why. While many people are hailing this decision to prevent smaller companies from going into insolvency, it also simultaneously takes away the rights of these smaller companies where they are creditors instead of being debtors. The IBC, like having practiced this on the ground level and having represented numerous such companies, on the ground level, I know that for a fact that the IBC was an excellent mechanism for smaller players to put pressure on the big fish so that they can, liquidate the dues out of fear of, purely out of the fear of commencement of insolvency. So this move would certainly reduce the workload of the NCLTs, but for the reason that I just explained, it might prove to be counterproductive in the long run for smaller players. While I feel these, of course, as we discussed, another issue is, I personally feel that this amendment of changing the threshold from 1 crore, from 1 lakh to 1 crore is applicable prospectively, meaning only to new cases which are filed after the amendment, this should be applicable, that the debt should be 1 crore. But I would like to inform you that the Delhi High Court is seized of a matter, and the order was passed on 23rd of June, just like 3 or 4 days back, wherein it has taken a prima facie view that it should be applicable also to cases which are pending adjudication. So I think the case is titled Pankaj Agarwal versus Union of India. I think the Union of India has been directed to take instructions regarding the applicability of the circular, because the whole purpose is to prevent and protect MSMEs. However, while an amendment will be only prospectively applicable, the Delhi High Court has taken this prima facie view that it should be made retrospectively applicable also for cases which are yet to be admitted. So we'll have to wait and watch what view the Delhi High Court finally takes. Over to you, Tansi.
Yes, so that's quite true. And from what I gather, there is a need to re-examine how the existing IBC and insolvency procedures can accommodate the concerns arising out of COVID-19, and also how to balance the rights of both debtors and lenders. And coming to my last question on the impact of the pandemic on the insolvency procedure, which is that lockdown measures have severely impacted the liquidation value and fair value of stressed assets. So how do you think this will affect the ongoing insolvency resolution processes, as well as fresh applications that will be passed after the moratorium?
That's a very tricky question, Tansi. There's absolutely no denying that the liquidation value and fair value will undergo a huge change on account of the lockdown. But the catch is that the IBC defines these values, that is liquidation value and the fair market value, on the date of commencement of insolvency and not at the time of submitting a resolution plan. So for existing cases where resolution plans have come in or are expected to come in, there's definitely going to be a problem regarding these values. So the NCLT or NCLAT or the Supreme Court will have to clarify regarding the liquidation value and the fair market value, because the liquidation value on the date of commencement will obviously undergo a huge change as on date from the date it was originally calculated. So, but the in either case, the prospective resolution applicant who are planning to submit resolution plans or who've already submitted resolution plans, they will have to reconsider their offers. Like if we think commercially, it doesn't make any commercial sense for the value at which they had given a resolution plan to ascribe the same value today, whereas there is like the scenario is absolutely changed. if there is no force majeure clause, and if they cannot go back they cannot renege on their word, they're in a huge soup. So in either case, the prospective resolution applicants will have to reconsider their offers, and the resolution professional or the committee of creditors may contemplate reevaluating the corporate debtor. But having said that, the Supreme Court in the Maharashtra Seamless case has clarified that a resolution plan can be below liquidation value also. So basically, the liquidation value or the fair market value is only a benchmark for the lenders to consider the viability and feasibility of a resolution plan. It is not to be shared with the resolution applicant. So in such a scenario, I doubt if it will make too much of a difference.
Yes, as you highlighted, there definitely are concerns, even though the liquidation value is important at the time of the beginning of the insolvency proceedings. There will be a need to re-examine how COVID-19 and the impact on the value of companies will affect the bidders now, and especially after the fresh applications once the moratorium is lifted. And that was extremely helpful, and that was extremely enlightening in terms of how the pandemic has impacted various aspects of the resolution process and the insolvency process. And I, for one, learned a lot about the technical aspects, and that was extremely briefly and explained in a very simple manner. So thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you so much for taking out the time of your busy schedule to talk to us about all this.
Thank you so much, Tansi, for having me here once again. It was quite an honor, and I hope this reaches its desired audience, and I hope they see the great work that the Contemporary Law Forum is doing. Thanks once again.